Hello everyone. So today I'm going to talk about physiognomy, and how physiognomy predicates and informs almost all thought processes and subsequently all movements, actions, everything that human beings are capable of. In fact, all processes of the world are physiognomical processes in some way. And this will also touch on, of course, the idea of determinism, which is something I spoke of in a previous video on my video, Fate and the Will, which I made almost 2 years ago. Now, Nietzsche famously and truthfully pointed out how behind all thought processes there is a physiological movement associated with that process. Think, for example, of how it's impossible to truly feel happy without smiling, and if you smile, you will sort of trick your mind into being happy and whatnot. Same said with frowning and sadness. When someone feels anger, this is accompanied by physiological movements: the gritting of the teeth, the clenching of the fist, the tightening of the musculature of the face. And also Nietzsche alluded to how internal processes, physiological processes, which we can't see, for example the processes of the bowels and the organs and of the mind itself, will probably serve as a counterpart to the mental processes which we talk about. And this has been proven to be correct. In neurology, neuroscience, what have you, and biological functions, we understand that feelings of anxiety and uneasiness often come. Well, there are for example, there are many moods which directly correspond to chemical processes. For example, the feelings of happiness is really a many-fold sort of feeling, which is accompanied by sort of different chemicals such as dopamine, serotonin. I forget the others, but yeah, there are many sort of chemicals which result in different types of happiness. Serotonin is usually produced by a feeling of power or satisfaction in some ways, like your plans were satisfied. This produces serotonin. Dopamine being more associated with sort of the satisfaction of the appetite. Let's say hunger, lust, things like this. When those are satisfied, one experiences dopamine, like a sugar rush, for example. And then, of course, cortisol is strongly bound up with stress. If you feel stressed, your cortisol has increased. And likewise, if your cortisol increases, you will feel stressed. And the same can be said for many different moods and emotions, and even mental conditions like schizophrenia, autism, and what have you. In addition to being predicated by genetics, there's actually a process of, say, the schizophrenic or the autist, which is a chemical process in the mind. I'd go so far to say is thought itself is not like Descartes envisioned it in his res cogitans, as like this sort of thing in itself outside of sort of the human form, the human biology. Almost like it's like this sort of element of humanity through which we're imbued with like godliness, which ultimately comes back to the Greeks with logos, the zoon, echon, logon, the thinking, feeling animal, with the logos and the logos being composed of sensory perception and intellectual apprehension. This constituting a human being as opposed to an animal. If we look at neuroscience, what thought doesn't come from like some abstract soul that is immaterial, but rather it is really a physical process of the firing of electrons from various sort of cells and various atoms of various cells, nerve cells in the human mind, and the combination of the number of cells, different types, and in what way they relate to each other, an almost infinitesimal sort of multitude of different possibilities which could happen at any moment, different arrangements that are possible. That is what a thought is, essentially. And much in the same way as we can say, give a person a certain chemical, maybe it be a certain type of food or hallucinogenic, or maybe we just like give them a medication to increase various chemicals in their mind. We can alter their thought patterns, you know, it's almost, there's almost like a very obvious sense of sort of relation between the physical and sort of the mental, the thought pattern. In this sense, we understand that if we give to the depressed patient, dopamine pills, and he's going to feel his brain like produce more dopamine, and whether you call this happiness or not, that which generally would be called happiness would be produced in the mind, in this sense, or at least half of it, I guess. When it comes to morality, Aristotle, of course, once said there's like a fourfold sort of procession which happens in the formulation of morals. First, there is the shock at evil, which is taken inherently, and then there is a feeling of glee and satisfaction knowing that other people are meeting their demise, and then there is guilt, which comes from our understanding that we too will meet our demise, and then finally there's compensation, which is the mores themselves, which emerge then. Nietzsche pointed out then that all mental processes are also physiological because they tie in with physiology. But what Nietzsche didn't go as far to say, yes, which I'll say in this video, is that physiology is entirely informed by physiognomy. The form itself, the way something is shaped, the material, ultimately predicates the movements which that thing is capable of. This ties in with what Heidegger says when he says that inasmuch as we are in the world, that Dasein's being is always being in the world in some way. And you cannot exist without the world existing along with you. It would be not possible to say, swing your arm through the air if the air didn't exist and what have you. And if all of the material around you didn't exist, and if you weren't composed of the exact cells of which you were composed, the actions which you would be capable of, including thought, would be totally different. Thought is a physical thing. The shape, number, and combination of atoms and cells and what have you produces the phenomenon of thought. And so Descartes' res cogitans, or the thinking thing, which is itself just a reformulation of the Platonic or Aristotelian logos. This is itself sort of a fallacy, because thought itself is part of the res extensia. It's part of the form. It's not separate from the form. And say that the divinity, if there's divinity, we'll say like a supreme being or what have you, this being would have to be material rather than immaterial and transcendent and what have you, beyond the abyss, as it's often presented in world religions. But what does this say about judging people's thoughts and what have you? And well, first, before I go into that main point, I'd like to talk about how this comports to the will. Because you might say, well then, we have no free will, and then you might say, well, do we have? If we have no free will? Then that defeats the whole purpose of will as a concept. But here's the thing: will is aphenomenal. Will is a concept. It's conceptual, but it's a concept which we use to refer to a feeling of the congruency of drives. Now, those drives are physical, of course, because they are all composed, predicated by the physique in some way or other, you know, much in the same way as how lifting weights will increase testosterone, which will then increase adrenaline and other hormones, which will then make a person think a certain way which they wouldn't think otherwise. We see this, say, for example, in hang on a sec. Yes, what I was saying. Well, I've forgotten what point I was making there, but yeah, just to move on to further how physiognomy can be used to judge people. Not only can we change our own thought patterns and whatnot through physiological processes, basically by changing our own physiognomy, basically. This means the cultivation of health and the abundance of health is really an incredibly important thing to mental patterns. If you see a person who isn't physically healthy, you can pretty much disregard their ideas because they're not going to have any profound thoughts. And if they do have the semblance of profound thoughts, they'll have to either be parroting it from someone else, or they'll just be sort of coincidentally coming up with these ideas from whatever books they read. But there's another thing. When you listen to someone speak and you hear those words and you remember them, you must remember that remembrance itself is a physiological movement. It is memory is stored in certain parts of the mind. We know that if a person gets hit in some part of their skull, they might lose memory. But if they get hit in another part, they might not lose it. This implies that memory is a physical thing. It's not an immaterial, transcendent thing. We know that if a person loses their frontal lobe, they will become like a vegetable. But if a person loses, their cerebral cortex, they die. And so we understand that the different parts of the brain serve different functions. We know about right, left side brain and what have you. I don't pretend to be an expert on neuroscience, but all I'll say is that these basic principles of neuroscience imply that thought, memory, etc. are physical things. Now, if there is a metaphysic behind, say, these physical patterns, that's neither here nor there. All we're saying is that everything has a physical correspondent. All actions, thoughts, movements, processes of the world correspond to physical things. And if there is some sort of metaphysical sort of understanding of the world, or if there was, say, a divinity, that divinity would also have to correspond to the self-same physical processes, Yeah, so if you look at a person's physique, if you look at a person's facial features and what have you, I believe it's highly possible that maybe the technology might never exist, but certainly hypothetically, as a thought experiment, we often hear from quantum theorists and what have you that if every particle in existence could be analysed at exactly the same time, the entire course of human history, of the human future, I guess, could be predicted, because we'd be able to understand exactly every way in which every particle interacts with each other. Of course, in reality that's absurd. We never have such technology. But as a thought experiment, it checks out. Much in the same way, hypothetically, you could look at a person's face and judge on a person's body and analyze the particles that make up that person's body, and you would be able to have quite an accurate view of the beliefs that person will have and how they will act in the future. This isn't science fiction, because in China, this exact technology is actually being implemented. In China, they've taken a photograph of every person in the country's face as an adult. It's mandatory by the state. And so they have a photograph of the face of every single person who's ever committed a crime, at least since the procedure was implemented. And they've found that certain physiognomies of Han Chinese people, these are all people within the same sort of ethnic group, and of course the Han Chinese, not to go on a tangent, but they're also composed of older ethnic groups who merge together, but the racial holisticity of it all also makes it easier for them for this technology to work. But what they found is that a person's facial features will inform what kind of thought patterns that they'll have and what kind of crimes that they'll be able to commit. And now the government in China is preemptively trying to stop crimes by monitoring people with certain facial structures. So you can imagine how what the backlash would be from people in the West if that sort of thing was implemented, because obviously in the West we have different races, and then yeah, people would people would obviously have big protest about judging crimes based off people's facial structures and what have you, but and yet it's totally dystopian, don't get me wrong, but it proves my point. Everything is physiognomical. In as much as it is physiological, it's also physiognomical, because physiognomy predicates and informs physiology. And if you look at philosophers throughout history, you look at Karl Marx with his unkempt facial hair going off in all different directions, like his beard, which looks like it's been growing since he was a teenager, and versus say someone like Søren Kierkegaard, who has a sort of a boyish, babyish face. Like, he looks like his ideas will be sort of softer, I guess. Like, he'll see life as sort of a tragedy and whatnot. Or if you look at, say, Emile Cioran with his sort of Dracula-esque, sort of brooding, sort of lugubrious facial expression and what have you. The way his eyes are look like sort of glazed over and dull and almost animal-esque. You can tell that he's going to have some sort of nihilistic view, as well as like the determined, like furrowed brow of someone like Nietzsche. You can almost tell the person's views based on their facial structure. And if you apply this to real life, if you look at your friends and people you meet in real life, and you look at how they look, in particular the strength, physical strength, if they are physically weak as a man, they're going to have some views and opinions which seem ridiculous almost, and when confronted with some question of the physique, immediately they'll fall over themselves and not be able to their ideas won't be able to hold water at that point. So yeah, the cultivation of health subsequently is one of the most important, probably the most important factor regarding the cultivation of ideas. The Greeks understood this as well. Aristotle also was one who said that the body is the image of the soul, essentially, which is the whole purpose of this video. The body is the image of the soul, and the cultivation of the body is also subsequently the cultivation of the human soul. So yeah, this is another really long video. I could go off on more tangents and what have you, but I'm just going to leave it there. Everything is physiognomy.